Alrighty, so we've got ourselves another team announcement as the Minnesota ROKKR have officially announced their roster moving into the Modern Warfare 2 season. Now, we all kind of expected it, right? The rosters have been discussed. Some of them have been maybe leaked or talked about, and this is the lineup that we have been waiting to see be official for a few days now. So I want to talk about the Minnesota ROKKR. I want to talk about this team in particular and honestly discuss why I feel like this team, this franchise organization, very well might have just won the offseason already. When we talked about ROKKR last year, you know, the ending team was Havoc, Standy, Attach, and Priesta. It was not surprised that this team decided to make a change moving into the next season, considering that they missed out on COD champs. But not only did they make one move, they made tons of moves. In fact, they wiped the entire board. This is the second time throughout the 3-year history of the Minnesota ROKKR franchise that they have decided to totally wipe the board moving into a new title. And now the roster moving into next year sits as Attach, who has returned alongside of Cammy, Bance, and AFRO. So what I want to do is talk about really the main piece that ROKKR focused on coming into this offseason, which was Attach, right? Their primary goal, and they talked about this throughout their press conference, which is something we speculated about, which was Minnesota ROKKR, your first plan of attack is to try to make sure that Attach is back on this team. I mean, after the year that he had, after, you know, being able to pull off the role change and to do it as solid as he did was unbelievably impressive. And it's something that if you are Minnesota, you're thinking, hey, we saw this guy do it for half of a season. Did we just scratch the surface off of what could be I don't want to say a career revival, because Attach was still looking great with the SMG, but if we just tapped into this entire new level of his gameplay that we just saw a moment of when we talk about half of last year? And when you look at his overall season and Vanguard, the first half of the year solely with the SMG has a 1.08 KD. The second half of the season, in which he was roaming with the AR at all times, he went up to a 1.16 KD. And when you do look solely at just his second half of the season stats, so if you look at his second half of the season matched up with every other player's second half of the season, he sits behind in the AR role just Dashy and Celium in overall KD, which is unbelievably impressive and something that you are very excited about if you're a Minnesota ROKKR fan, considering that Dashy and Celium just had a career year. Dashy had one of his best years that he's ever had as a player. And then you have Attach, who just switched into this role. Whenever he was in it, he instantly looked like a top 3 AR player in the entirety of the game based solely off of stats. And the best part about Attach too is that he's not just a great player, you know, in game, you know, already considered to be one of the greatest SMG players of all time, but he's such a great piece. And he is one of the most valuable free agents out there. Again, not just because of the gun skill, not just because of the talent that he expressed this year, but it's somebody that you don't have to worry about mixing well with other players. And that is something that I'm so glad that Minnesota was really focusing on throughout this press conference, was talking about Attach's intangibles. He's going to come in, he's going to be great for the team, be great for the coaches, for the franchise, for the fans. From a community perspective, he's obviously very involved when we talk about socials. That's always going to be a positive. So shows up on time, respectful of the players, respectful of the teammates. It's somebody, and that's the reason why we talk about it, why he is one of the most valuable free agents, is not just because of what he did this year, but because of you have no worries throwing him into a team and wondering if it's going to work. You know that it will work based off of what he will do. The other players and a lot of top players out there, you can't always guarantee. When we talk about relationships, we talk about just, different players being able to work together. You have really no doubts when we talk about somebody like Attach. So, all those things to say that he's also a veteran, great in-game communicator, brings leadership. And like I said, just scratch the surface now with the AR in his hands. And I thought that this was probably going to be Minnesota working as hard as possible to ensure that the Attach and ROKKR partnership can continue moving into next year. That's exactly what they did. And I was also hoping that they would be working with him to bring in the players that he wanted. And that is exactly what happened. And now we got to talk about what ROKKR were able to do. And one of the biggest, additions that you bring into this team is the Toronto integration, right? The Toronto integration for me is unbelievably important, really, for any roster out there, but specifically for Minnesota. You know, the Toronto Ultra lineup in Cold War specifically, but also leading into Vanguard. That roster, that four-man team showed us some of the very best strategic and most impressive teamwork that we have ever seen from a lineup in Call of Duty history. Their ability to make decisions on the fly, you know, just their talent level of maybe not being the greatest slang roster out there, but being able to do it just simply based off of how well they communicated, how well they were aware of where other players were on the map. And while a lot of people will not deem this as impressive, I do, because the Toronto Ultra managed to get top 4 at a tournament this year without winning a single hardpoint in the tournament. Has that ever happened? If it has, it's maybe happened one other time than what the Toronto Ultra did at Major 1. Toronto Ultra also managed at some point, and it was also involving Major 1, they managed to go on a 2-18 stretch in hardpoint and somehow did not make a roster change. I mean, we talk about those two statistics, those two numbers, and I know they were very close to making a roster move. And a lot of people are, you know, a lot of Toronto fans are probably grimacing, thinking like, you know, that was a hard time for us. But the fact that they finished top 4 at a tournament without winning hardpoint, the fact that they went on a 2-18 stretch and still did not make a roster change goes to show and just gives a credit to the fact, well, this team did not have a great slang year last season by any stretch of the imagination. They still were able to see success at certain times, and we know that they did at Major 1. We know they did when they were in their own home major in Toronto at Major 3. I think they finished top 3 in the tournament. We saw some great moments, and the problem for Toronto last year in Vanguard in comparison to what they did in Cold War was that they never really did have that same slang power mixed in with a great strategy, because we saw to end this season strategy and slang mixed together perfectly, and that was the LA Thieves, right? Their teamwork and understanding of the game finally managed to unlock their slang power that we knew this roster had, and from that moment they were far and away the best team in the game. And the problem for Toronto this year is that, unlike LA Thieves had the slang talent, they just couldn't get the strategy, they couldn't get the ability to be consistent in all modes. Something finally clicked for Toronto. They can click, it's just a matter of that slang being there for them. It was not there last year for the roster, and that is something that you do ask yourself moving into this year with all 4 players, but specifically for these two, Bance and Cammy, now here into Modern Warfare 2. But like I said, the problem with Toronto and the reason why they weren't considered the second best team in the game this year was the fact that they had the slang mixed in with the strategy, and we're the undisputed second best team behind Atlanta FaZe. And really, in Cold War, it was because of 2 players in particular. Like, you look at the stats, and it speaks for itself. Stage 2 major first, stage 3 major third, stage 4 major third, stage 5 major second, COD Champs 2021 second. Ever since this team formed, when they had both of those things working for them, they never finished outside of the top 3. And as I said, the 2 players who were the culprit behind them having such talented slang mixed in with that strategy was Insight and Cammy, 2 members who were in the AR positions for the Scuff Team of the Year. You know, we're, you know, I guess the best AR combo that we had in the entirety of the game. In Vanguard, they go to being ranked 10th and 12th when we talk about all ARs, just strictly in terms of KD. So not a horrible year. I think a lot of people would say an average season from these 2, but you know, when they're at their peak, what they could do, and that's the reason why Toronto didn't have that same success. And despite really too, Cammy having what I would label as an average season, I think he finishes like around a 1 in basically everything except for S&D. Despite every player on Toronto Ultra, especially Cammy, being called out by the community at multiple times to be dropped, right? Every single franchise this offseason was willing to bet on him again. How often do we see that? Like, how often do we see a player who is on a certain team be called out so much to be dropped from a roster, to then have every single franchise knocking on his door and really wanting to add him to the team? And I know a lot of people could say, well, that just happened with Kenny this year. And I agree, right? It has not happened very often. I know we saw a few instances of it this year, but it's not common, right? Cammy was linked to possibly going to a team like the Atlanta FaZe, right? That was a very real possibility, and a lot assumed that it could happen. He was linked to be going to the New York Subliners. He was linked to maybe going to the LA Gorillas. Boston Breach were very interested in having his services as the flex role for them. And to top it all off, Optic Texas, like that was one of the players alongside of Hydra that was discussed the most seriously to be going there in place of Dashy and Illy. The ultimate compliment is for Cammy to have had this season, for teams, or rather for the community to have, you know, talk so much about all of these players, but Cammy specifically, and then he comes into this offseason picking things up a little bit and is now being looked at by Atlanta FaZe, by Optic Texas in a very serious manner, and all the other franchises that we just discussed. So very intrigued about both of these players. I know I didn't talk a lot about Bance, and I will hear in just a moment when we talk about somebody else, but very much in favor of Toronto Ultra, that combination of players now being here on this Minnesota ROKKR'S squad. And for big reason, we talk about Cammy, which again, we'll talk about him just a little bit more in a few minutes. Now, the fourth and final player, I believe could make the Minnesota ROKKR'S skyrocket and reach their fullest of potential. When we talk about ceilings for different teams, this roster has a very high ceiling, and a lot of that is going to be based off of what AFRO does. I would say, if I had a description, right, where I said, like, you know, Toronto Ultra, what did I say? It was something along the lines of like the integration is important. I would say for AFRO, the headline would be diamond in the rough. Like, it very well could be possible that a lot of franchises just missed out on having what could be one of the best SMGs in the game moving into next year. I know a lot of people could say, well, he was one of the better SMGs that we had this year, but I am talking about top 5 potential in the game, not just in the role, but in the game is where I feel like somebody who has the skill set of AFRO could reach in their third season, their second full season now coming into MW2 would be for him. And I thought coming into this off season, really that he was just going to have the quick transition to go to Toronto Ultra, right? That was the initial rumor. That's what we heard a lot, was that, hey, you know, it's probably going to be Bance to London, AFRO to Toronto, not really a trade, but just, you know, 2 pieces moving either direction, and that was going to be the end of it. I thought there's probably going to be a lot of North American teams who just look over, you know, his numbers and say, okay, you know, had a good year, but really on land didn't really have the greatest of success, which we'll talk about. And that was really going to be the end of the story. And that to me is a very impressive thing that Minnesota ROKKR did this year, was that they were willing to look at EU talent. They were willing to look at somebody like AFRO. And they did, I guess, a similar thing when we talk about the original Modern Warfare season. The first year of the CDL, they were willing to add a player like Alex, who did have a very good start to that year. I know eventually would kind of trail off and, you know, sadly is no longer in the CDL, but definitely had a lot of promise. So we've seen the Minnesota ROKKR invest in an EU type of SMG before. Now they don't just have one, they technically have 2. And another guy who is young, has a lot of potential, and like I said, I think has top 5 player in the game type of potential, and I don't say that about just anybody. Now, one of the biggest worries, as I said, in a lot of teams and even in the community, and it's justified, right, is the online versus LAN success. London Royal Ravens, we talked about it constantly. I think in all the casts that we had, you know, throughout the broadcast talent, we discussed, hey, the Ravens online versus LAN, 2 totally different teams. And it felt like, despite having, you know, a good performance at Major 1, for example, where they had that top 4, top 3 placement, you know, it was really Zero who was leading the way. Major 2 just didn't have it. Major 3 just didn't have it. Major 4 qualifiers looked great, and then they go out, I think it was last place. Like, you just saw what could have been something great and one of the more consistent rosters in the Ravens, a young team, but just never really were able to put it together. So you saw Gizmo's numbers from LAN to online, drastic difference. AFRO, his numbers from online to LAN, especially for an SMG, and these numbers are very delicate, right? We could talk about ARs all day and talk about, hey, you know, the leading KD for somebody like Celium was like a 1.25. I don't know what it is. You know, the third highest ranked AR KD of the season was like a 1.15 or something. For SMGs, it is very different. So I want you to know, I want you to recognize that these numbers, you know, sound pretty drastic, but I want you to recognize the rank of KD differential between online and LAN. So AFRO in online matches, online gameplay in Vanguard had a 1.07 overall. Very, very good. Number 4 SMG in terms of KD online throughout this season. In LAN, 0.95 KD. So it does go down. It's not a horrible KD by any means, but when you do look at the SMG ranks, he goes from, like I said, a 1.07 to a 0.95. Number 4 SMG KD online, number 17 SMG in terms of KD on LAN. So you can, like I said, you can see the variables between just, you know, not a dramatic difference in overall KD. It is a sizable difference, but you can see the ranks, how many players sit between 4 and 17, between a 1.07 and a 0.95. And that's very, very important to try and get that consistency. And that I feel was something that a lot of franchises weren't scared about, but it definitely was the one thing that maybe made you less interested in somebody like AFRO. And I will say one thing that I do love, though, that the Minnesota ROKKR decided to do with this roster was that they're bringing in a superstar type level of talent in somebody like AFRO, and they have Bance alongside of him, right? That to me is the guy from a strategic standpoint that could absolutely help this roster, which we'll talk about next, but also at the same time be the exact player that AFRO needs, a veteran, somebody who is going to make the long route, set you up for success, make sure that you have all the communication that you need to be the perfect player to work alongside of. This to me is going to be the potential breakout season for AFRO, not just because of the fact that now he has, you know, his first full season underneath his belt, not just that he's playing under Minnesota, but because specifically he's playing with somebody like Bance. And that kind of caters me into this next point. We'll go ahead and bring up the roster builder that comes in from breakingpoint.gg. I will put this link down in the description. You can make your own lineup yourself. You can throw in all kinds of different players. And what I decided to do is put all 4 of these guys now for this Minnesota ROKKR team. Now that it's confirmed, you can actually take a look at their stats in Vanguard and really start to compare. See, at least in terms of last year, granted, these guys were on 3 different teams respectively. All 4 of these players, they were on 3 different rosters in total, where they would have mixed up in some capacity. So it's not going to be 100% accurate, but at least gives you a good depiction of where these guys sat last year, maybe how they could start to rank together. And one thing that to me goes underneath the radar really is the lowest KD overall. Like you see a 1.1 in terms of overall KD, which is solid. You get a straight 1 hardpoint KD. In control, you see a 1.04, very high control kills per 10 minutes at 75.4. But you see the S&D, right? The S&D sits at a 0.98. That is something that I think will be really a primary outlier for this roster. I think that they will see a lot of success, as a matter of fact, in S&D this year. Not just because it's Bance and Cammy. That is a primary reason for all of that. Because we know what Toronto could do. We know the talent that exists with this roster in Search and Destroy, but also because of these 2 other guys. Like I think that AFRO has displayed already that he could be a great S&D player. I mean, the amount of times on, and I know we're not going to have, at least I don't think we're going to have another map like Bocage next year, but similar to what he was able to do on the A side instead of bottom grandmas, his aggression. I mean, how many times did we see AFRO start off a Search Destroy like 8-1 or, you know, 9-2, and a lot of times it was in those high intensity, very fast pressure type of moments where an SMG needs to have the fast reaction. The fact that, you know, AFRO can do things like that is something that you're very excited about. And you see the S&D KD for an SMG that's solid at 1.04. You see the kills per round is also very high, as it should be. But like I said, you have Bance and Cammy. I'll say first, before I talk about them more in depth, Attach had, I think, when we talk about his S&D KD this year, 1.08. I know in Cold War it wasn't amazing. So if you're talking about Attach with the AR in his hands, how great he could potentially be now moving into the next year with that gun. And then the same thing can be said for somebody like Cammy. I mean, he has, I think, the lowest S&D KD. Him and Bance are actually tied with a 0.92. The big thing for me is that if we expect to see Cammy have a better year than he did in Vanguard, well, we look at Cold War, and he had the second highest S&D KD of the entire season, just behind Inside. I think he had like a 1.16 in Search and Destroy. So that is one thing to look out for, as not only are these 3 players going to be great in Search and Destroy, especially having Attached with the AR, AFRO being as aggressive as he is, Bance being there for the strategy and working alongside AFRO, but you also have the potential for Cammy to really erupt in this game mode for the team as well. So I really think that Search and Destroy has the potential to bump up quite a bit. The one doubt, which I guess is a mixture of a few things that I could have about this Minnesota ROKKR team, because I've said a lot of positives, because I really do like this Minnesota team, is just the slang element. Because there are, with every roster, right, with every single team, you are going to have some doubts. You are going to have some things that you are hoping works out if you're a franchise or if you're a fan of the team. And that to me would be on really a few different players, because you do have some risks, right? I mean, let's say that AFRO doesn't reach that next level. Let's say that he, kind of remains as a, better SMG in the league, but maybe when it comes to LAN, just never really reaches that full potential that we know that he absolutely has. If he doesn't reach that level, we talk about how important the SMG line is. Bance isn't going to be somebody who is going to put up, a 1.1 KD in terms of, SMG spots. He's somebody who sets up the rest of the team. He's somebody to go on the long routes, to set up the plays, to set up the flanks. So that is something to look out for, because if AFRO doesn't reach that elite status, how often do we talk about SMGs, your most important positions? If he doesn't see that rise, that is where Minnesota could really start to lack. And then you get to a situation where you're like, hey, we have AFRO. We don't want to get rid of him. We have Bance, who's such a great in-game voice. That's something that Minnesota talked about so much, is that they've been lacking that for the past 2 years. Having Bance in this role, who do we get rid of if that is where they see a lot of their issues coming from? So that is something to think about if you're Minnesota. Another thing is going to be on Cammy. I think without question, more than any of these other players, the spotlight is on him, because like I said, a top 3, top 4 at bare minimum is what I would say he was in Cold War. An MVP candidate up and down. Is he going to have one of those years? Or are we going to have another Vanguard year? Or is it going to be somewhere in between? That is something that you're also very much investing in. And like I said, if you're Minnesota, it makes you feel good, because not only were you willing to invest in Cammy, Optic Texas apparently was. Maybe Atlanta FaZe was. I'm sure that New York, LAG, Boston, all of these rosters, franchises were having conversations who are also willing to make the same bet as you. But like I said, it is a risk in some capacity. Can he be that top player again? If he can, that's exactly what this Minnesota team needs. You need to have a star player in order to win championships consistently. In order to be a contender consistently, you need to have those star pieces. And that very well could be Attach and AFRO. It could be Attach and Cammy. It could be Cammy and AFRO. It could be, the list goes on and on. But considering the role that he's going to be playing, considering the situations that he's going to be in, Cammy needs to be a top of the line player in this game and for this roster. And like I said, he can help improve the Search Destroy to not just be good, but to be elite, be great, if he can have those same numbers that he had also back in Cold War. And the same thing can also be said for Attach. We technically said we've scratched the surface with Attach. Maybe Vanguard was just a great year for him to transition to an AR. Maybe those numbers start to normalize a little bit. Is he really going to be behind Celium and Dashi moving into this next title? Last year would tell you yes. Next year, how's that going to work? Because like I said, we saw half of a season, not a big sample size. So those are the last things that I will say. To me, expectations are high. I'm titling this video and I'm talking right now about how they very well might have just won the offseason. They very well might have had the biggest rise out of any team really who made a change this past year. So if we're talking about a team who was in the bottom 4 of last year, they might rise into the top 4, power rankings coming into this season. And to me, that's a big shift, especially when we talk about the CDL, when we talk about how many top caliber rosters that there are. We talked about last year, how there were 7-8 teams who all had a chance to either be in the top 8 or to fall lower than the bottom 4. To be able to potentially rise that much would, at least in my eyes, put them as a favorite to possibly be winners of the off season in terms of who got that much better than where they were last year. So like I said, a lot of eyes on this Minnesota ROKKR team. A very, very exciting prospect moving into next season. AFRO, Attach, Bance, Cammy. What do you guys think about this team? Where do you see Minnesota ROKKR being at? I know it's early. We talked about a lot of rumored rosters out there, but where would you put them in the overall standings you feel like for this next season? Do you think that they're contenders? Do you think that they'll be a top 5 type of roster? Or do you feel like Minnesota Rokker just made a massive mistake? Feel free to let me know down in the comments. I greatly appreciate the support on the channel, and I would love to hear more from you down in the comments. Feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel. More off-season Rostermania content to come, and I will see you guys back here very, very soon. Thanks for watching. See you in a bit.